the session again for the recording, because a lot of people watch the recording, and I would love to have that title said in a more cohesive way than I did.
Yeah, it would be
Um,
nice to put this up on Kelpa so that artists and scientists could dialogue on this because
oh, that's actually a good idea, Michael.
yeah,
Amy, and I'll brainstorm with Amy. Maybe we can do something like that.
yeah,
And then also on our site too, where we have
right.
the STEAM week. So, all right, I am going to turn it over to you, Michael, and we're ready to go.
Okay, great. Well, first off, it's really nice to see everybody. Well, I mean, figuratively, as much as Zoom lets us see each other. Yeah, so the idea of why scientists must also be artists obviously goes the other way too. Why artists must also be think and act and approach their art to some degree like scientists. But the idea is that we look into the disciplines of creativity and artistry, and particularly to altruism, which is the ability to sacrifice and give of ourselves for the well-being of humanity, um, uh, and why that's necessary to stem innovation. So hopefully this we're we'll be able to dialogue this as motivating. I have two specific places that I'm going to just pause for comments, but as we were just saying, please go ahead and just at any point along the line, if you want to unmute and just like, well, what about, it's perfectly okay because again, we're a small little group of folks here that are kind of exploring how do we fix our world and how can science be incremental in its approach to creativity and artistry, and how can we merge these disciplines that for centuries have been separated. So we'll see where we go on this, and I'll go ahead and use mostly PowerPoint, and I'll be talking behind the scenes because I don't particularly want to look at my morning face here. So if you don't mind, we'll go ahead and get started here. And then, as I said before, both using the chat room. If anybody is going to monitor the chat room, that would be great because my current setup doesn't let me do that without blocking off the PowerPoint. So, okay, good. All right, so that first piece, by the way, you heard was a piece of music that was composed by somebody who had spent a good portion of his life investigating environmental science, and then he became then went into the military, and then he became a full-time composer. He's out of Harlem. He was the conductor of the Harlem Gospel Choir, as well as a jazz artist that has traveled much of the world. Somebody that I worked with for years when I was living in Europe. And everything you heard there was an amalgamation of this kind of entire approach to the way the arts need to, in some ways, be disciplined and have this scientific approach. And so we'll see this importance of exchange that goes back and forth. First off, just a little empowering kind of sentence to kind of start with, or quote to begin with. The innovative scientist, the scientist is perceiving and endowed with vision, whereas she who is ignorant or neglectful of this development is blind. The investigating mind is attentive, alive. A scientist is a true index and representative of humanity, for through process of inductive reasoning and research, she is informed by all that pertains to humanity, its status, conditions, and happenings. She studies the human body politic, understands social problems, and weaves the web of texture of civilization. In fact, science may be likened to a mirror wherein the infinite forms and images of existing things are revealed and reflected. And so we see the importance of science, and we see the importances of STEM fields, but you'll notice that some of the key words there I highlighted in gold also require vision, implied in that is intuition and investigating mind that is attentive and alive, not something that just follows mundane formulas and only pertains to standardized outcomes, that we understand social problems and relate our sciences to the problems of our world. And that we're always constantly, connected to the problems, and what was said here is the texture of civilization. And so we'll continue to kind of explore this, and hopefully maybe come up with some ways that we can do that. One of the things that I really like is people oftentimes talk about thinking outside of the box. And so if you think about when we were most creative, when we were the best learners, science points to the fact that as young children, we are basically a learning machine. We are constantly out there imagining all the possibilities. If we apply our science to linguistics, we look at the actual words themselves. So what do we mean figuratively, in this case, by box? Well, box pertains to a whole variety of things. One is an inability to imagine the integration of discipline. So if we're thinking only in a discipline in a certain way, and we're isolating ourselves from the entire community, from civilization, we're very often we're only going to be able to see things in a very kind of narrow vision. And so a box is literally any kind of parameter. It can be cultural parameter, why we have racism, why we still function on the parameters of patriarchy, of male control and domination and so many things. All these evolved over centuries, and those are basically parameters of the box itself. And so you can see the box in many ways in which our institutions have evolved out of the structures of our ancestry before our ancestry was concerned with things like climate change and solving the problems of cancer and pandemics and things like this. So those would be the parameters of the actual box. Next is thinking, and of course, understanding that thinking requires imagination, it requires intuition, it requires a whole variety of different manner by which we approach imagining and contemplating and reflecting on problems. And then the outside component is specifically how we can solve problems that have not been solved within the conformity of the box. That is, imagining that we can go ahead and find other ways of approaching a problem that have not been explored. And if you look at all of the scientific innovations over time, and certainly artistic innovations over time, you see people that were able to magnify this concept of thinking out of box in action. And so as an example, you see a child that has a box. As adults, we imagine box as something we put things in, and we're going to cart from our offices to here or there or whatever. But a child sees a box as a possibility of any myriad of possibilities, anything that can be done. In this case, a pirate ship. And so we obviously have some work to do to be able to go ahead and magnify the capacity of the arts and sciences to not function in our little siloed disciplines, but be able to go ahead and create a unified process, something that they share in common, which is creative problem solving. There's an actual discipline out there called CPS, which is creative problem solving, the ability to apply creativity to problem solving, which is basically a methodology of practicing thinking outside of the box, thinking and living outside of the box. One of my favorite mantras is a scientist / artist, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And I think you'll see that very often we narrowly define people as, in this case, a civil rights activist, and Einstein as a physicist and whatever. But you'll see that the people that we most admire in almost every discipline were equally scientists and artists. And in this particular kind of unknown or lesser known quote, he says, "The hope of a secure and livable world lies with disciplined nonconformists who are dedicated to justice, peace, and brotherhood." And then he goes on to say, put your faith in the disciplined nonconformists. So for all the things that we need to solve, put your faith in the disciplined nonconformists, the discipline of obviously being scientific inquiry, the approach to being able to kind of prove things, be able to scrutinize things, to challenge hypotheses and work them through. But nonconformity is that ability to imagine and to think literally, to live outside of the box. And so we kind of need those both. And he says that the hope of our secure and livable world and justice, peace, and brotherhood itself is going to require those two qualities. So one of the things that I find kind of interesting is we very often talk about critical thinking, and we know that critical thinking is a huge part of scientific inquiry, and it's also a huge part of scholarly work and academic work. And critical thinking is never going to go away. But if you look at the kind of the assumptions and the definitions of critical thinking, we also see that there is a component of creative thinking that differs from critical thinking, or might be seen as a needed partner to critical thinking. So these are definitions from the University of Massachusetts Creative Studies program, but I like them because they boil down what we oftentimes use as definitions, but fail to actually kind of really define them. So critical thinking, we seek to scrutinize the assumptions, reasoning, and evidence brought to bear on an issue, and such scrutiny is enhanced by placing practices in tension with alternatives. So obviously that scrutinizing and looking at things and making sure that we put practices in tension with others, and that we bring the evidence into bear on these issues. This is, of course, an important part of scientific inquiry. We can also say, though, however, that this tension of things in conflict with others oftentimes creates this argumentative approach, in our case, to disciplines within the academy. That, we have STEM and we have art and we have science, we have math, and they're all kind of divided. You're in this room, I'm in this room. And we can also say the same thing about, our ability to communicate across cultures, across races, to be able to say that race is a construct, but not even be able to break it down or imagine that that's part of the scientific process, seems to be counterintuitive to the very definition here of critical thinking. And so now we come down to creative thinking. And so how does that potentially differ or supplement critical thinking? And we have this definition, which I really like as an artist, because I'm always dealing with complex and messy and ambiguity. I mean, I think just becoming an artist, you have to be somewhat willing to go ahead and put yourself in a place and space where you walk out into the world. And I frequently have been at parties and they say, well, what do you do? And somebody says, well, I'm a surgeon. Somebody else says, well, I'm a mathematician. And I say, well, I'm a musician. And there's kind of this cold, silence that goes across the room. But in truth, creative thinking is very much essential to the solving of problems. And so creative thinking, according to this definition, which I really like, includes generating alternative ideas, practices, and solutions that are unique and effective, and exploring ways to accommodate complex, messy, ambiguous problems, make new connections, and see how things could be otherwise, or generate new insights with value to others. So if we unpack this just a bit, the idea of making new connections is that we begin to establish learning communities, and learning communities that cross these ancient disciplines and allow ourselves to go ahead and collectively look at things that are complex, messy, and ambiguous, like solving world hunger or climate change. These are problems that don't just fall in the realm of science. We can prove that climate change is a reality. We can prove what's causing it, but we also have to change the manner by which we live, the manner by which we consume, the manner by which we establish our values and what we perceive as being power. And these are messy and ambiguous problems that require all of the fortitude and the disciplined nonconformity of artistry and creative thinkers as well. So to be able to make these new connections, to be able to solve these problems, as you look at the models of scientific innovation, like Einstein, et cetera, you'll see that they are very frequently people that uphold and actually magnify the qualities of artistry and creativity. All right, let's go ahead and just stop for a second, because that's enough before I play a video here. Anybody have any thoughts or ideas or anything you want to go ahead and bring to bear on what we've discussed so far? Because that's just sort of the introduction here. And if we hear crickets too long, we'll just move on. But otherwise, feel free to go ahead and just jump in and unmute. Agree, disagree, it's perfectly okay. Remember that inquiry allows us. Go ahead.
So I'm listening to what you have to say, and I actually took a screenshot of your little critical creative thinking section, because I'm thinking about, I teach science middle school, but I'm thinking about our staff in general in terms of teaching as an art and as a balance between that creative and critical space, in terms of everyone wants to say that something negative means that you're a critical thinker, but really we're really wanting people in education to be creative thinkers and in sciences and I just think that's a really interesting idea of what we think of forward movement as. Forward movement is a positive, and yet we often look at it as being a painful process.
Julie, I think you summarized really well the tension between the academic structure that we've all been brought up with and our need to go ahead and solve problems that are emerging as being highly, highly critical and in need of problem solving, but the tools we're using aren't necessarily apropos to the problems themselves. And so as we kind of unpack some of the things you said, first and foremost, of course, is the idea of building learning communities and the idea that we as instructors and we as faculty and we as scientists and we as artists need each other to kind of create this kind of inclusivity. And then the idea that you said, and you actually said it in the way you said it, is this kind of principle of either or and or is the difference between what we call, what Lakota culture calls the world of the square and the world of the circle. And the world of the square is an exclusive one where it's either this or it's this. So it's a dualistic or monolithic principle. Whereas the world of the circle means we need Julie's ideas, we need Susan's ideas, we need Chrissy's and Ian's and Tracy's, and we need everybody's idea, and we put them in the circle. And from that melange of different ideas and different principles, we're able to go ahead and have much more kind of cultural genetic structures to work from that we can go ahead and ultimately solve problems that heretofore have been unsolvable. And so you're right. Yes, the idea that we go around kind of professing authority and outcomes solely without that ability to be humble and to be questioning and to be able to be in that murky territory where there isn't just a single answer, to use the structure of our past in terms of sciences. There are obviously some things, 2 times 2 will always equal 4, or at least for the foreseeable future. but once we get beyond that, the idea of inquiry, which we're going to get into in a little bit, demands that we have this kind of questioning approach, and we nurture this, and we nurture it in our students. So I really like the way you framed that. That was really nice. Okay, anybody else want to add to that? We'll have plenty of other places to go ahead and do that. So, feel free, because I just think it's really important that we just share ideas. In fact, I'd rather almost stop my PowerPoint, just we talk for the rest of the time. But then I feel like, well, why did I do the PowerPoint? Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and go back to this, and then we'll just stop frequently. So again, thank you for that. I'm going to play a little bit of a video that I like to use. This was for about 10 years, the most viewed TED Talk until probably about 8 years ago. Ken Robinson has since passed away, so this is kind of a tribute to him. But he asked the question, what is the motivation of a scientist being an artist? And then he said, what is missing from our education? And the ultimate question he asked is, do schools kill creativity? And I think one of the things that we're kind of pausing to do here, based from COVID until the present, but some of us have been questioning this for some time, is in fact is our approach to the industrialized model, which will kind of explain how that came about, is our industrialized approach to education, the standardized approach to education, does it kill creativity? And so let me just play a little bit of this, and then we'll come back to it.
I have a big interest in education, and I think we all do. We have a huge vested interest in it, partly because it's education that's meant to take us into this future that we can't grasp. If you think of it, children starting school this year will be retiring in 2065. Nobody has a clue, despite all the expertise that's been on parade for the past 4 days, what the world will look like in 5 years' time. And yet we're meant to be educating them for it. So the unpredictability, I think, is extraordinary. And the third part of this is that we've all agreed, nonetheless, on the really extraordinary capacities that children have, their capacities for innovation. And my contention is all kids have tremendous talents, and we squander them pretty ruthlessly. So I want to talk about education, and I want to talk about creativity. My contention is that creativity now is as important in education as literacy, and we should treat it with the same status. Thank you. That was it, by the way. Thank you very much. So, 15 minutes left. Well, I was born... No, I had a great story recently, I love telling it, of a little girl who was in a drawing lesson. She was 6, and she was at the back drawing, and the teacher said this little girl hardly ever paid attention. And in this drawing lesson, she did. And the teacher was fascinated. She went over to her and she said, "What are you drawing?" and the girl said, "I'm drawing a picture of God." And the teacher said, "But nobody knows what God looks like." And the girl said, "They will in a minute." What these things have in common, you see, is that kids will take a chance. You know, if they don't know, they'll have a go. Am I right? They're not frightened of being wrong. Now, I don't mean to say that being wrong is the same thing as being creative. What we do know is, if you're not prepared to be wrong, you'll never come up with anything original. If you're not prepared to be wrong. And by the time they get to be adults, most kids have lost that capacity. They have become frightened of being wrong. And we run our companies this, by the way. We stigmatize mistakes. And we're now running national education systems where mistakes are the worst thing you can make. And the result is that we are educating people out of their creative capacities. Picasso once said this. He said that all children are born artists. The problem is to remain an artist as we grow up. I believe this passionately, that we don't grow into creativity, we grow out of it. Or rather, we get educated out of it. So why is this? In the next 30 years, according to UNESCO, more people worldwide will be graduating through education than since the beginning of history. Kids with degrees are often heading home to carry on playing video. We know three things about intelligence. One, it's diverse. We think about the world in all the ways that we experience it. We think visually, we think in sound, we think kinesthetically, we think in abstract terms, we think in movement. Secondly, intelligence is dynamic. If you look at the interactions of a human brain, as we heard yesterday from a number of presentations, intelligence is wonderfully interactive. The brain isn't divided into compartments. In fact, creativity, which I define as the process of having original ideas that have value, more often than not, comes about through the interaction of different disciplinary ways of seeing things. And the third thing about intelligence is it's distinct. I believe our only hope for the future is to adopt a new conception of human ecology, one in which we start to reconstitute our conception of the richness of human capacity. Our education system has mined our minds in the way that we've strip-mined the earth for a particular commodity. And for the future, it won't serve us. We have to rethink the fundamental principles on which we're educating our children. There was a wonderful quote by Jonas Salk, who said, if all the insects were to disappear from the earth, within 50 years, all life on earth would end. If all human beings disappeared from the earth, within 50 years, all forms of life would flourish.
That was pretty negative. I forgot that he put that in there, but we'll go ahead and just stop for a second and see if anybody has any thoughts about that. Anybody has any points or reflections on the video? Did anything resonate?
Yeah, well, my art teacher kills my creativity by always saying that we have to do everything her way and stuff like that.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's even in the arts, we see that the idea of so if we apply the scientific methodology, or I should say not even the scientific methodology, the industrialization of education to the arts, we become so focused again on the technique and the outcome that we fail to allow people to play. Technique is necessary. So discipline part of the nonconformity is essential. If you don't know how to play an instrument, it's hard to create on that instrument. If you don't know anything about how to hold the paintbrush or how to mix colors or things like this, it's going to be difficult to create anything of value. So a certain amount of discipline is necessary. But if we squander the capacity to encourage nonconformity and most particularly creativity, then even in areas like the arts, Faye, you get to the point where you begin to start to kind of like lose that sense of play and that willingness to take risks and willingness to make mistakes that is indigenous to our 5-year-old, but begins to get trained out of us as we progress. Yeah, so I'm sorry. I'm sorry to hear that, Faye. That's not good. Good. Any other thoughts or comments? Okay, so yeah, so he does go on and he gives a really good story, and I probably should have played it too. But one of the things that we see in all of our classrooms, no matter what we're teaching, is that the confines of the industrialized methodology of presentation and instruction, and certainly assessment, provide a very narrow window for the utilization of human intelligences. So we know from Gardner, going all the way back to whenever he first published, and actually before that, Herskovits and others, we know that we are multiply intelligent. We know that growth mindedness is the belief that intelligence can be grown, and that it can be grown in all the ways we perceive the world. So visually, orally, emotionally, there's so many ways that we are able to be and manifest intelligence. And the full scope of that, we used to talk about left brain and right brain, and we created, that was the science of the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, actually moving all the way up, arguably, to the 90s. But now we know that the brain is wonderfully more interactive than that. The brain plasticity is the dynamic of our kind of growing the interconnections across the quote unquote hemispheres and the various portions of the brain. And so intelligence is marvelously dynamic and wonderfully diverse. And if you only provide material in a certain context and only assess it in a certain context, then you are basically limiting the focus by which someone can be and manifest their intelligence to a very narrow parameter. So somebody who's very visual or very emotionally intelligent or whatever is likely to have a completely different connection to anything that is scientific or STEM based, how much more to artistic instruction. Then obviously a standardized exam would allow. And so we have to start to move away from this. And of course, none of us have been trained in alternatives that are as dynamic as the human brain is, or as human intelligence is. So this is going to take some collaboration and definitely some teamwork. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and move on just a little bit more. Hopefully we can generate some more input here. But so I was just at a conference recently, and yesterday, I guess that's really recent. And there's a variety of things that came across the pipelines of the discussions. This is one article that somebody referred to in one of their presentations, but it concerns math and independent thinking. Many students enter my class thinking that math class is about right and wrong. They do not consider themselves math people. I work to tear that mindset down by creating a culture that values questioning over correct and incorrect answers. And of course, any STEM teacher that truly loves to be able to see students succeed is going to think this way, but that isn't necessarily the way assessments and assignments have necessarily been built. So then they have to kind of go back to the next thing, is how do I deliver and assess this? My room is plastered with quotes that have been shaped, that have shaped my beliefs about the goal of education and how I feel about life. I introduced one by Piaget at the beginning of the school year. The principal goal of education is to create individuals who are capable of doing new things, not simply repeating what others have done. The goal of my class isn't about helping students become computers. It's about teaching them to become independent thinkers. And so, the quote that comes to mind, one of my favorite quotes, is again a quote by Einstein. And I think it relates to a large extent to how we teach and learn. Everybody is a genius, but if you judge a fish by its abilities to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it is stupid. And in a sense, that goes to the manner by which I think we tend to both instruct and assess scientific inquiry as well as academic inquiry just in general. And so we have some work to do, I think, to promote independent thinking and to reward it. And I guess that's where we're going to try to go here. So if we look at the kind of summary of world problems, proliferation of nuclear weapons, increasing global population, availability of energy, spread of infectious disease, climate change, armed conflict, poverty, hunger, the economic situation, international terrorism, you want to add cancer and anything else onto this. Certainly racism and gender inequity, you definitely want to factor those in, because 50% of the population is still being held to standards that are not the same as their counterparts. And so we're missing 50% of our world's population's greatest insights as long as gender inequity exists. So we have quite a few problems I think we can agree that need to be solved. And clearly we need to be able to go ahead and find a way to dialogue these. So the explosion in technology and world connectivity, global interdependence in climate, finance, health, and problem-solving, cancer, climate change, pandemics, requires the rigor of science and the creativity or spirit of artistry. This is from MIT. And then here's just a couple of quick quotes that I'll just add on to that. Airplanes are not designed by science, but by art in spite of some pretense to the contrary. I do not mean to suggest that engineering can do without science. It stands on scientific foundation, but there's a big gap between scientific research and the engineering product, which has to be bridged by the art of the engineer. After a certain high level of technical skill is achieved, science and art tend to coalesce in aesthetics, plasticity, and form. The greatest scientists are always artists as well. All right, let me go quickly look into the chat room and see if there's anything. Okay. All right. All right. So how did we get here? And so if you're familiar with kind of the evolution of the academy, the Greek academy was based on documentation and scientific method, but it also included philosophy, spirituality, and science. So Socrates believed, as an example, that there was a power greater than us. And so we had to be able to go ahead and kind of harness or look into that idea of the soul, of the spirit, that's where intuition comes from. And this also animated the Islamic Golden Age, which was the beginning of a lot of the things that we now hold as kind of dear to the academy, including the first two universities, which came out of Cairo and out of Morocco. And they were the ones that also established the medical profession and degree granting that we do today. So they started that kind of disciplinary separation that then transferred over to the medieval academies. So when we talk about universities in Europe, we very often think about Europe exclusive to Islamic cultures or to Greek cultures, and of course that's again a narrow kind of siloed vision of the world and the evolution of what we do, even including science in the academy. And it was good in terms of the idea of research and citation and respecting each other. So if I'm going to go ahead and cite one of you, I want to respect you. I think we'll keep that going for some time. There is some benefit to disciplinary specialization, but at some point also it begins to kind of silo us and keep us from moving on. We have to factor in, however, as all these wonderful innovations in education and in science and in the arts were developing, so too was an evolution of very toxic characteristics that also impact everything we do. Imperialism, which is the act of believing that my value or the value of our culture is increased by the conquering and or exploitation of others. Patriarchy, which of course is a very, very toxic mindset that believes that men somehow or another are supposed to be in control or power, going back all the way to tribalism, and the fact that men had greater physique and greater physical attributes. That is not the problem we're facing in society today. It's not a lack of muscle. It's a lack of empathy, arguably, and other characteristics that are deeply representative in women and needs to be a kind of addressed. And then the idea of merging these together, imperialism and patriarchy, led to a concept that is competitive capitalism, and that's placing value, material value, on things that are material and competing for that. So we see that even in our academic structure, we're competing for enrollments, we're competing for A's, we're competing for this and competing for that. And rather than encouraging and nurturing risk-taking and collaboration, we're putting people in this kind of diametrically opposed mindset, which is really contradictory to problem solving. It's contradictory to empathy and cultural humility, and it's certainly contradictory to bridging some of these otherwise isolated gaps. So what might be a right-sized vision is that the STEM fields are the exploration of physical reality in our planet and universe, and a key to answering questions about physical reality, but the arts require intuitive, spiritual, and humanistic conscience that act as a balance. So arguably, we would say that we need them both. I like this quote by Socrates: "Give me beauty in the inward soul, may the outward and the inward man be at one." And the idea that human beings have a spirit, or they have a soul, or they have an intuition, however you prefer to do it, may not be something that we can prove through material sciences, but it may be something we might want to choose to not neglect, because the artists are required to go ahead and reach into themselves and reach into that kind of belief that there's something beyond them in order to be able to kind of solve problems. And certainly Einstein and some of the greatest scientists believe this as well. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and just kind of go over this really quickly. Old science is kind of that examination of things based on these siloed parameters. And one example is the right brain, left brain idea versus the capacity to imagine that our brain is a single organism that does have components and compartments and things, but they very much intersect. A full brain experience is an example. We know, those of us that are musicians, that when you're playing a piece of music, you're relating to sound and to vibration with your emotions, with physical muscle memory, with all kinds of things. And so really it lights up the entire brain. And so now we have the ability to scan the brain and to be able to see the way the brain actually works. And that's why we're able to dispel old science, is because old science is no longer valid once we have new methodologies to prove alternatives. And if you look at science always like that, then you always imagine that what we see and what we do is only a tiny fragment of what can one day be. Remember, only 60 or 80 years ago, we were still putting leeches on people and bleeding them. And that was science at that particular time. So it's important to kind of stay right-sized. And to do that, we try to introduce humility, cultural humility, as well as just humility in general. If we look at new science, we see there's a whole bunch of things that are kind of advancing our vision of intelligence. Neurologic advancements of neuroplasticity, particularly experiences and memories that relate to learning, change of brain structural plasticity. And so now we have ways of measuring this and seeing this. And that's why we know that if we begin to liberate the human intelligences beyond kind of an industrialized model, we get so much more growth and so much more insight and capacities for problem solving. Multiple intelligence theories we already touched on, and obviously growth mindedness is the ability to imagine that all intelligences can be grown. So somebody in a math class or in a science class may feel defeated by previous experiences with math and science, but a very artistic and creative science and math teacher immediately opens their mind to the possibilities that encompass their unique intelligences, and all of a sudden that person is back into the science and math modality. Now they believe that they're a scientist or a mathematician. Conversion of scientific problem solving, we'll see that in one of the slides coming up, so I'm going to kind of move on. And then the idea of community-based creative problem solving is something that particularly performing artists do, and that is we cannot imagine as musicians not working in learning communities. It's hard to have an orchestra on your own. It's hard to create music, and it's hard to do dance and have theater if you don't have a collectivist group of people. But very often in the sciences, although we do have research teams and things like this, we're not promoting necessarily creative community building across the disciplines, nor are we seeing learning communities as a perpetual process of constant problem solving and questioning and integration of disciplines beyond our own. So that's what we see now as kind of the modality of new sciences. So you can see that the creative discipline and the scientific method are really quite nicely aligned. But in particular, I'm going to kind of point out here that the creative discipline, those of us that teach composition, we always kind of teach the power of observation, the ability to see what other people are missing. So this is that creative questioning. What is murky here? What are we missing here? What are other people not seeing? If I'm going to write a song that's unique, it can't sound exactly like somebody else's song. Okay, so conversely, if I take a science class and I'm basically given a formula and there's a clear outcome and I'm supposed to match that outcome, I'm basically put in a position where my power of thinking is reduced to finding a way to get to that outcome. That's what standardized exams also do. Reflection is that ability to tap into a higher vision or a power or a spirit of imagination. And then that leads to the capacity to harness our 5-year-old child, which is the ability to think out of the box, to improvise, to take risks, to imagine practicing spontaneous risk-taking and interdisciplinarity, to say, what is, if everybody has been doing, let's say, the solving of cancer or something in molecular science, is there a possibility that environmental science and diet and mindsets and living values and whatever that can play into the manner by which our body reacts? I'm going to go ahead and stop here. I thought I heard somebody, so that would be nice to hear somebody. So anybody want to reflect on any of this? Any thoughts come to mind?
Okay, yeah. Wow, that was a lot. That was just a lot. So I've got a collection of kids that are kind of rough this year. And I think that there's a lot going on for them.
Yeah.
So I've been listening to the Body Keeps Score. And it talks about how, there are things that people react to, or kids can be reacting to something that is unconscious for them, that I've looked at them in a way, or said something in a certain, or I've communicated something to them in a certain way, right? Because of their trauma and I'm thinking about what they're doing in class as how do you find a way to reignite that engaged, physiological, inquisitive, interested person, right? How do you tie into all of that whole person as they look at this phenomena of it's fun. I teach a great subject. It's fun. It's dessert, in my opinion. It's dessert of your day. But how do I get it out of that sort of rigorous, or rigor, right? That's the word we all want to talk about. Academic rigor is so important, so great. How do we take it out of that realm of rigor, even though that's important, and into this sort of personal space for these kids? That's just what I'm thinking while you're talking.
No. So I think you hit on the quintessential question here. And that is, so we've been brought up in this industrialized model. You understand, public education, everything that we do, from standardized exams to this model or this perception of rigor, which is very limiting in its capacity to allow for. Rigor is important, absolutely important, but it can't be in an either or in a rectangular structure where it's dualistic. It's either this or this. It has to be inclusive with creativity and collaboration and whatever. So I'll give you my theory. Obviously, I have no answer, but I have what I'm imagining and what I'm working with in terms of people that I'm working with. One is the idea of a learning community. In other words, Julie by herself cannot solve this problem, because no matter how creative or inventive you are, as long as those exams have to be done, and as long as your school district or your principal or whoever it is that's making that's determining the parameters of outcomes for you, creates a structure in which the teaching of the quote unquote rigor, or or teaching to the exam, or teaching those outcomes, becomes more important than building the sociocultural structure of a learning community within your classroom that allows you to weed off and find out what else is going on in these guys' lives and what else they're going through, and also to kind of figure out what their intelligences are, and where are their superpowers located, and how to be able to liberate the manner by which you teach and learn, and the outcomes that are factored there around independent thinking and problem solving, and all the murky qualities that we know we'd much rather have them do. Passionate, self-motivated learning. I mean, that's the core to learning. We know that. Everybody knows that. Everything that we do on our final exams, in our classes and whatever, we pretty much flush down the toilet when we leave. That's the brain does not retain that, because it's not patterned into the usage in our lives. It doesn't carry through, and we know neurological retention demands that we keep moving those ideas across our neurons and applying them, and with a greater amount of emotion and greater amount of connection to our lives, it becomes not only retained, but becomes part of our kind of like the passion of our living, the passion of our growth. And so we know self-motivated learning is the key to retention. It's the key to usage of what we teach, and it is not at all linked to standardized outcomes. So I guess the only thing I can say, Julie, is you're not alone in your thinking. There are people like you, and misery loves company, and there's power in numbers. And so, I urge all of us, kind of like we're doing here, to go ahead and have these conversations, and know, as we build communities around the creative transformation of intelligence maturation, and of the teaching of creative understanding of the whole person, that we're going to be able to eventually get there. The thing is we're asking these questions and having these conversations in ways we did not before. And one of the things the pandemic has done is created this kind of dissonance of human well-being and business as usual. And this could be a wonderful place for us right now if we're able to go ahead and apply the mindsets of artistry to education. If that made any sense at all. Julie, are you still there? Did I put you
Yeah,
to sleep?
I was kind of percolating on what you were saying.
Oh, okay, good.
And I was thinking, I was thinking about that, and I was thinking about, like, as you're talking about all of this, and as educators, we really do sit at the crosshairs, right, between so many different things. But and I was thinking, particularly, as you're talking about a specific student who is struggling, right, and
Okay.
and it's manifesting in a lot of behavior, and for other teachers as well, and for me, and like I've been really struggling with, you don't get to run this classroom, but you also have a place here, right? Like trying to find that balance of,
Yeah.
Whatever. But anyway, that's a whole other story. But there was another teacher that was working with him, and she was really angry. She was really frustrated, and really upset. And I'm thinking back to, what is she really frustrated about? And it's frustration over trying to get these kids to have an outcome that is unilateral across so many different people, right? Like we say everyone must reach a benchmark, right?
Right.
But I'm never going to be past 5.3, no matter how much you cajole me, right? Some kids are going to be where they are. You can't make them all think the same way, because we want that, because we can
Yeah.
measure, right? So we can measure something.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think you really hit on it. And so the idea here is, and especially if we're going to talk about inclusivity and cultural diversity. So there's a thing called hidden intelligences in sociology that we always talk about, or hidden curriculum. And hidden curriculum is that mindset that this is the way things are done or should be done. Most of it linked again to all the imperial, patriarchal, all those kinds of infrastructures that are kind of inherited from thousands of years of history. And we're operating on that same mindset. The entire industrialized model was linked to that. And so now we're looking at somebody who comes in, and we see a resistance to that based on culture, based on personal circumstances or whatever. And we don't have in the classroom, we don't have the place and space to go ahead and place as high, or maybe, well, potentially for a while, higher outcome parameters on self-motivated learning, multiple intelligence engagement, on passion, on learning community, collaborative skills, and all the things that would help liberate that student to kind of heal those wounds that they incurred from earlier on, from the teachers who were training the creativity out of them, or from things like racism and gender inequity and all these other things that are kind of playing on their parents or on whoever it is that created the scars that they're reacting to. So if we understand, whether it's divorce statistics, we have the highest divorce rate in the world for whatever reason that is. Sweden beat us out for 2 years. So I don't know what was happening in Sweden, but other than that, for like the last 20 years. And so there's a lot of kids from broken homes or from homes where they're, where there's conflict. And we factor in all these different parameters, plus what's going on in our society, the political argumentation and inability for civility. They feel these things and they bring these things in. And so if we don't have a platform by which we recognize that ultimately their passion to engage your topic or your subject will ultimately fuel the engagement of that topic and subject beyond the classroom and into their future, which is where learning really occurs. And we began to kind of postpone some of those standardized exam outcomes. It's going to be impossible to imagine that a lot of the problems that you're addressing here, which I think everybody is addressing or feels or sees, are going to be remedied. And then again, I think part of our careers have to also allow us to have conversations like this, and then let's try this and let's try this. And so there's a lot of really creative things that are going on. There was a wonderful this arts and arts conference that was the last 4 days at the University of Michigan. People were basically saying everything that we're talking about. So. Okay, I don't have a lot of time left, so I'm going to go ahead and just kind of jump into the punchline of whatever it is we're doing here. But I would love to just go ahead and talk about pedagogy here, because I think that's at the basis of everything. So, Okay, so here's a couple of my, again, favorite quotes, and I like to be inspired. I feel in inspiration. I continue to kind of feel like I can move on. And I think some of what we're talking about is the relationship of arts and creativity to that inspiration. Somebody who really buys into science, into scientific methodology, and was born to do chemistry, and we get a few of those in, they're going to respond to our class no matter what or how we teach it. And beautiful that we have those, because that keeps us motivated. But with a lot of our students, you'll see that, I think scientific inquiry in the STEM fields are indigenous to all of us, but so too is artistry and creativity. And so if we look at the people that kind of had these both, and I've already cited Einstein and Martin Luther King Jr., it's Dr. King, but Einstein says the most valuable thing a teacher can impart to children is not knowledge, but a longing for knowledge and understanding, and an appreciation for intellectual values, whether they be artistic, scientific, or moral. It is the supreme art of the teacher to awaken joy in creative expression and knowledge. I would go so far as to say, if we don't awaken joy in creative expression and knowledge, that we're failing to do our job. Imagination is more important than knowledge. The revolution introduced me to art, and in turn, art introduced me to the revolution. That's that nonconformity we talked about, discipline nonconformity. And then Dr. King says, who I think is the consummate, again, artistic scientist, modern man has brought this whole world to an awe-inspiring threshold of the future. He has reached new and astonishing peaks of scientific success. Yet in spite of these spectacular strides in science and technology, something basic is missing. There is a sort of poverty in the spirit which stands in glaring contrast to our scientific and technological abundance. The richer we have become materially, the poorer we have become morally and spiritually. We have learned to fly the air like birds and swim the sea like fish, but we have not learned the simple art of living together as brothers. The hope of a secure and livable world lies with disciplined nonconformists who are dedicated to justice, peace, and brotherhood. And so yesterday yesterday was Friday? Yes, Friday, whenever that was. Some questions came to mind, and these were artists and scientists literally from around the country. Actually, there were some people from outside the country. And a couple questions came to mind. In what manner do current traditions and practices run contrary to your intuition, to the requirements of our world, the principles of balance or laws of physics and math? If you like stories, music, art, and engage these practices for your own balance, how can you justify not using them in the applications and practices of STEM? So these were two questions that I thought were relatively profound that came out of a lot of the sessions. And then the dean of Stamp School of Art and Design basically said, each of us has a spirit, and that spirit is unique, and that spirit must be supported and allowed, nurtured, and encouraged. Paraphrased, when tenure is based on publication in elitist journals and adherence to traditions that do not support change or altruism, research should support art. Research should support art. Art should motivate and inform the spirit of research. Art and research is about healing. This is a rich common ground so many of us share. I think I got that right. I had to transcribe that literally as it was coming down. So I guess here's my final thought. There's obviously a need for us to create a plan for action, to imagine the future, to find the questions, to craft solutions, generate ideas, explore acceptance, and do this in a multidisciplinary, multicultural methodology. And we have a window now. I think the window will probably stay open for a while. But we might want to go ahead and apply one of my favorite applications of physics is Newton's third law on larger issues. And that is, when two bodies interact, they apply forces to one another that are equal in magnitude and opposite in direction. And so if we look at our world's problems, climate change, racism, gender inequity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, we see that the amount of time and the duration by which we've been exercising the muscles of disciplinary exclusion, by gender inequality, by all of the things that have kind of placed the values of imperialism and competitive capitalism and patriarchy as the kind of the outcomes of success, both in our classes, in our learning, and certainly in the sciences, need to be balanced by an equal and opposite force of artistry, creativity, and to some degree humanity and conscience. And if we can go ahead and begin to kind of explore that and also demand that potentially of our educational institutions, create learning communities that create a stronger voice so that this reform can be imagined, I think anything is possible. And so I guess my thing would be say, don't ignore the minds of the artists. Don't ignore collaborations with musicians and dancers and painters and things like this, because to do so eliminates some of the genetic qualities that are essential to problem solving. And I think on that, I'm going to stop. Does anybody have any thoughts or questions or concerns?
Thank you for it's been very thought provoking. Like, thank you for the opportunity to communicate and be part of these ideas.
Oh no, it's a pleasure. I wish we could do this every day. So nice to meet you too, Julie. All right, anybody else have anything to add or subtract, to divide, multiply?
We have a quiet group today.
Yeah, it looks like it. We're all feeling like the weather.
Yes, yes. Well, I'm going to put in the chat our next session, which is December 3rd. So there's a link, and you can register there and you can find out about it. And I want to thank Michael Naylor. He's been generous with his time now 2 years in a row, and I very much appreciate it. So
No problem. It's my pleasure.
all right. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Bye
Bye, everyone. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, bye.
Bye.